The Seattle sky seemed to conspire with the occasion. Dense clouds covered the horizon, like a heavy, opaque quilt over a city that was already, by nature, silently melancholy. The breeze carried a smell of old rain. The trees around the cemetery swayed solemnly, and the light that escaped through the cracks in the sky was pale, almost courageless. Amidst this scenery, a procession of black cars glided along the private road that led to the family mausoleum. Whitmore, a white marble construction that reflected its owner's cold, meticulous taste. Brandon Whitmore, now officially the last patriarch, got out of the car with dry eyes and an impassive face. His black suit was perfectly tailored, but his tie was tighter than necessary. He walked stiffly as if each step was calibrated by an algorithm. This was how he had been raised, to walk with purpose, speak with precision, decide without hesitation. That's how the father, Carter Whitmore, shaped his only son. Not with hugs, not with childhood stories, but with spreadsheets, mock meetings, and silent dinners, with speeches about responsibility, growth, and legacy. The casket was placed reverently in front of the mausoleum, surrounded by a dozen figures dressed in black. Board executives, investors, discreet politicians, distant cousins. Everyone said something similar. Visionary man, built an empire from nothing, a leader ahead of his time. Brandon listened to everything, like someone listening to static. The absence of tears was not due to pride. It was out of habit. He had learned long ago that emotions have no place in the game of power. Vivian, Carter's second wife, was at his side. Tall, with impeccably tied hair, a serene face and refined posture, she looked more like an ambassador than a widow. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her eyes, an old tamed grief. She squeezed Brandon's arm as the coffin began to slowly descend into the underground chamber. The sound of the rope sliding along the pulleys mixed with the sound of the wind. It was as if the earth whispered a secret. "Your father left specific instructions for after the ceremony," she said in a low voice. "Howard will be with the documents." Brandon just nodded. His gaze didn't blink. He watched the tombstone being sealed as if he were witnessing a transaction, not a farewell. Hours later, the mood had changed, but the mood had not. The main room of the Whitmore mansion was a cathedral of order. Tall columns, elegant tapestries, furniture that had never been changed because anything was never allowed to be imperfect. The fireplace was lit, more out of tradition than cold. Brandon occupied the armchair that had once been his father's, and the weight of the leather beneath his body was more symbolic than physical. Howard Green, the family lawyer, was in front of him. Dark grey suit, perfectly combed hair, neutral expression. He carried a leather briefcase as old as the contracts his office had with the Whitmores, dating back to the 1950s. "Before we read anything official, there is an envelope that your father asked to be delivered directly to you, privately." Brandon took the envelope. It was heavy, sealed with black wax and the family crest embossed, the falcon on the scales, a symbol that had always seemed arrogant to him. "And the rest?" he asked, his fingers still not opening the seal. "The full will be read tomorrow, but there are clauses, detailed instructions." He thought of everything. Brandon let out a humorless laugh. "Of course you thought." Howard let out a slight sigh. "Carter planned his legacy like someone planning a risky surgery. I need you to be prepared." Brandon looked at the envelope for a few seconds before placing it in his inside jacket pocket. It wasn't time yet. He needed a moment, not of mourning, but of silence. The kind of silence that allows you to hear your own thoughts without the echo of the voice of a father who never apologized. Later, alone in the office with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a full ashtray without being a smoker, Brandon stared out the window that overlooked the pine trees on the property. The night was completely dark. No moon, no stars. It was the kind of darkness that suited the mansion. In the fireplace, the fire crackled low as if it were tired. He took the envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. He touched the tip of his finger to the seal, but didn't break it. Not yet. A part of him knew what was inside would change everything, and not just on paper. Next to the envelope was a book that he had taken from the shelf on impulse, Commercial Alliance Strategies in Conflict Regions. Carter often cited it as required reading. Brandon, at the time, was 17 years old. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He was the new head of an empire, the new face of a dynasty of rational decisions, and all I felt was the weight of emptiness. There was no pride, there was no sense of mission, just an inevitable path being laid out before him like train tracks, long, straight, cold. The envelope was still there, motionless. But his name was written in gold ink, like a promise or a trap. Brandon woke up to the pale morning light filtering through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom, the one that was now his, but still carried his father's scent. He had slept poorly, with his jacket still thrown on the armchair, and his shoes lined up in the corner out of pure force of habit, not his, but those of the servants. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if even the furniture had gone into mourning. The clock showed just after 6:30 when he rolled out of bed with a dry sigh. In the kitchen, the coffee was already ready. The housekeeper, a woman named Nora with grey hair and a discreet manner, prepared breakfast as he had done for decades. She didn't say much, but her presence offered an ancient stability that only very old houses knew. "Is there anything you need this morning?" she asked. Brandon just shook his head. Only silence. He sat at the long, lonely table where his father used to review contracts at dawn. Instinctively, his eyes fell on the day's newspaper, but the headlines seemed distant, irrelevant. The real earthquake had not been reported. It was there, in the black wax envelope that he had not yet opened. Last night, after hours in front of the fireplace, Brandon decided to wait until he was sober, lucid, cool enough to face whatever came. It wasn't fear. It was survival instinct. He knew that his father's words could be like blades hidden between compliments, and that every comma of his instructions carried more strategy than emotion. He returned to the office just before 8. The light passed through the stained glass windows with a bluish elegance, and the pictures on the walls seemed to be watching him. The envelope rested in the same place where he had left it, the seal intact. Brandon stared at him as if he were an opponent. Then, with the decision of a surgeon, which he never was, but which his father wished he had been, he broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, but each word pulsed with the weight of unspoken years. "Brandon, if you are reading this, it is because the inevitable has happened. I'm not here to justify myself nor to ask for understanding, just to fulfill my last responsibility as a father, to secure the future you don't yet see. I believe that the world is changing too quickly for those who don't know how to play, and to continue playing, we need alliances, structured, solid, unbreakable. What I ask of you, no. What I determine is simple. Fulfill what was agreed with the Al-Karim family. You'll know what that means soon. Don't run away from it, Brandon. Turn it into strength, in legacy. In the end, that's what's left. What we leave firm, not what we feel." The signature in black ink, firm, still carried the trace of the man who never hesitated. Brandon held the paper with tense fingers, as if it might change if torn enough. But the truth was clear. Something had been decided, and he had no choice. Later, in the side room, Howard Green waited, always punctual, always imperturbable. He had a thicker folder with him, this time marked with colored ribbons, something Brandon knew meant serious bureaucracy. "Today we begin the formal reading of the will," said Howard, "and there are specific terms that need your immediate attention." "Is it related to the letter he left me?" Brandon asked, already knowing the answer. Howard nodded with restrained movement. Carter established an international agreement, a commercial alliance sealed not just with contracts but with family commitment, something traditional but effective. Brandon didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the folder on the table. Howard continued, "The rest of the council has not yet been notified. He wanted you to have time to absorb. The implications are sensitive." "Tell me what he did," Brandon demanded, his voice low, controlled. Howard opened the folder ajar and took out a second envelope, white without wax but with the coat of arms in relief. "Her name is Layla Al-Karim." The sound of the name passed through the air like lightning in slow motion. Brandon didn't recognize him, but the surname does. The Al-Karims were notorious, biomedical magnates, leaders in genetic research, owners of a chain of high-end clinics in the Middle East and Europe. Discreet, respected, powerful. "He promised me," Brandon asked, now with his fists clenched. Howard, with the professionalism of someone who has been dealing with dynasties for too long, just confirmed. "Not just promised. The agreement is already in force, and there are dates, limits." Brandon was silent for a long time. The name echoed inside him. Layla, a woman he has never seen, never chose, never imagined, and apparently already linked to him by a plot that had begun even before her father's death. That night, upon returning to the office, Brandon locked the door and stood there staring at his reflection in the window. Outside, the garden seemed still, frozen. He leaned his forehead against the glass. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to do. The confidence which he had always used as armor now seemed to be made of wet paper. Who was this woman? Why would she accept something like that? What was the real interest behind the agreement? And, most disturbingly, what would happen if he refused? The routine at the Whitmore mansion was beginning to return to movement, but the atmosphere was still one of mourning, not for the feelings, but for the consequences. In the polished hallways, the sound of the service team's footsteps echoed as if they were walking inside a mausoleum. Carter's death had left a hole not in hearts, but in agendas, and that hole now had a name: Brandon. He avoided the East Wing, where his father's old room was, not out of weakness but out of contempt. What others would call memories, he called command remnants. Still, his days passed like those of a new king who did not ask for the crown. Expansion reports, budget reassessments, meetings with board members, everything demanded his attention, but his mind, for some reason he still didn't understand, insisted on returning to a name: Layla. It was like a subtle echo. Sometimes, during a video conference with hospital group executives in Boston, he would see the name in the corner of a screen, in a tab he had opened by mistake. Other times he thought he heard someone say Layla in the distance, and he mentally corrected himself, irritated by his growing obsession. On the third day after reading the letter, Vivian intercepted him in the hallway. She carried a thin briefcase in her hands and wore a blue silk robe, as if she were always ready for a diplomatic dinner. "You still haven't responded to Howard's proposal," she said, in a neutral tone. Brandon stopped, his hand still on the stair railing. "It's not a proposal, Vivian, it's a sentence." She smiled sideways. "It's an opportunity, you're just not ready to see it." "Ah, of course, a woman I've never seen, an agreement forged in the shadows, a legacy I didn't choose. How lucky for me." Vivian went down a step, approaching. "Carter made a lot of mistakes, Brandon, but he was a man of vision, and he knew you better than you know. He knew that if he expected you to accept it willingly, you never would." Brandon looked away. Her voice had that calm tone that always bothered him, because it was never emotional, always strategic. "Do you know this woman?" he finally asked. Vivian paused, as if calculating what she could and couldn't say. "I've seen her briefly, at an event in Zurich a few years ago. She was standing next to her father, always very discreet. A woman who walks into a room without needing to say a word to be noticed. Exactly the kind of presence that Carter respected." Brandon felt a slight tug in his stomach. Noticed without speaking, seen without being heard. It was almost an antithesis of the world he had grown up in, where power and presence were built with speech, tone of voice, and dominant posture. "And what do you know about her?" he insisted. "Only what anyone could know. Degree in neuroscience, master's degree in biomedical engineering. Speaks 5 languages. Never been involved in scandals, never given interviews. Has an impeccable reputation. But," she hesitated for a moment, "there's something curious. Even at public events, she always kept her face covered. Some say it's customary, others say it's choice. The truth? Nobody knows." Brandon frowned. "Covered, even in Geneva. Boston." Vivian nodded. "Exactly. Some say her face was burned. Others think she is extraordinarily beautiful and want to avoid exposure. I've even heard more spiritual versions, but no one confirms anything. She moves like a social ghost. And yet, wherever she passes, space opens up." That last sentence stayed in Brandon's mind for the rest of the day. Moves like a social ghost. Was this what he feared? That he was being dragged into the arms of someone who didn't really exist, but only as a concept? That night he had dinner alone in the smaller hall. The team had left a table set for 2, following a protocol that they might not even know how to explain anymore. He moved the chair in front of him before starting to eat, as if that removed the absurdity of the situation. But it was impossible to ignore that. Soon, someone would take that place, and he had no idea who he was. Back at the library, he decided to get his name out of his head the only way he knew how: work. He sat down at the walnut desk, opened reports, but his eyes slipped over the lines. Next door, by chance, was a printed file, material from the old deal with Al-Karim Innovations. He caught it, initially by reflex, but right on the first page he saw her full name: Layla S. Al-Karim. The acronym in the middle was new. S for Samira? Safia? I would never know. What caught his attention, however, was a footnote written by Carter in dry handwriting. The only way to build something lasting is by teaming up with those who understand silence as a tool. Brandon felt goosebumps run down his arms. It was like his father to say something like that. Cold, poetic, and sharp. But now the sentence seemed to carry a denser meaning, as if it was about to be fulfilled. At the end of the document, in small, clean font, was the estimated date for the Al-Karim family representative's arrival in Seattle. In 3 days. It was no longer a distant idea. It was a countdown. The third day arrived with the precision of a Swiss watch. It was strange how the days seemed shorter since Brandon first read Layla's name. It was as if time was conspiring in favor of the inevitable. He wasn't a man to believe in destiny, but it was hard to deny that something was moving beneath the surface, like a tide pulling his life to an unknown shore. The morning was gray, like most mornings in Seattle, but there was a dry wind that shook the trees harder than usual. Brandon came down to the main hall around 10 a.m., wearing the same dark suit as always. The tie, for some reason, was slightly crooked. He didn't correct it, perhaps out of carelessness, perhaps as an unconscious gesture of resistance. The house had been prepared for the moment. Nothing ostentatious. White flowers in silver vases, tea served on Japanese porcelain, trays with small oriental sweets, carefully selected by Vivian, who supervised every detail as if she were setting up a stage. And in a way, it was. Brandon knew. This was an act. The first performance of a play whose plot he had not chosen, but of which he was now the protagonist. Just before noon, the electronic gate opened with a soft hiss. A black sedan, discreet, diplomatic, glided through the main entrance like a luxurious shadow. Brandon didn't move from the window. He watched with forced calm, arms crossed, jaw tense. From the car, a middle-aged man got out first, his skin golden from the sun, and traditional clothes composed with a touch of modern sophistication. Tariq Al-Karim, Layla's uncle, and legal representative of the family in the United States. He walked with the firmness of someone who had once been a diplomat and probably still acted like one. His steps had the rhythm of someone who never misses the tone. Then a female figure appeared, and with her, the world seemed to slow down. She got out of the car with smooth, precise movements, as if every gesture was studied. He was wearing a long petrol blue silk coat, buttoned up to the neck, with silver embroidered details. The veil, black, light, translucent, just enough to suggest contours, completely covered her face. And yet, there was a presence, a firmness in posture, an absence that filled the air. Brandon welcomed them into the lounge. He was standing in front of the lit fireplace, where his father's portrait still hung prominently. Tariq was the first to reach out. "Mr. Whitmore, on behalf of my family, I thank you for having us." "Thanks for coming," Brandon replied in a tone that struggled to be neutral. His eyes, however, couldn't help but search for Layla's behind the veil. She was there next to her uncle, silent, with her gloved hands crossed in front of her body. She was shorter than he had imagined, but there was something erect and serene about her posture, like a living statue. "This is my niece, Layla," said Tariq, turning to her with a light gesture. She tilted her head slightly. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't speak. And yet Brandon felt like he was being watched from the inside. It was the most uncomfortable feeling he had had in a long time. They sat down. Tea was served. The first minutes were dominated by Tariq, who calmly explained the general terms of the continuity of the agreement initiated by Carter. Nothing aggressive, nothing urgent, just soft words stitched together with intelligence. Brandon listened, but his mind was elsewhere. In Layla. She didn't speak, but I heard everything. Sometimes he tilted his head slightly. Other times he remained motionless. Brandon wondered if there was a serene face in there, or if she was staring at him too. It was impossible to know, and maybe that was the point. At the end of the formal conversation, Tariq handed Brandon a finely carved dark wooden box. Inside, a golden medallion attached to a braided rope necklace. "It's an ancestral symbol of our family," he said. "We usually give it to our closest allies. Your father accepted an identical one in Doha years ago." Brandon took the object. It was warm, as if it was holding time inside. "Thank you," he said, almost emotionlessly. It took him a moment to realize that everyone was watching him. He got up. "I'd like to talk to her, alone." Tariq hesitated. "She can decide." They both looked at Layla. She stood still for a second, then just nodded, slowly and controlledly. They were left alone in the room for a few minutes. The silence between the two was dense like a heavy curtain. Brandon stared at her like someone staring at a painting. He knew it wasn't appropriate to ask what he wanted to ask, but I also knew that moment might not happen again. "You don't say anything, not a single word." She looked at him, or at least he thought so. "What would you like me to say?" she finally asked. The voice was clear, firm, without a marked accent. American, perhaps educated in Boston. It needs, discreet, unbreakable. Brandon hesitated. "Do you accept this? This union? This whole theater?" She was silent for a moment, long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he replied, "I don't accept it, but I understand." He frowned. "Understand what?" "That there are things bigger than the two of us at stake, and that sometimes freedom is built inside before it is conquered outside." Brandon didn't respond. I had never heard anyone talk like that, and he had never felt so much anger and so much curiosity at the same time. "Are you going to keep wearing this? How long?" he asked, indicating the veil. She tilted her face slightly without changing. "Until it's no longer necessary." Silence returned, and it was more deafening than any response. A few minutes later, Tariq returned, and the meeting ended. Layla said goodbye as lightly as she had arrived. No touches, no unnecessary gestures. And yet, when the car disappeared through the iron gate, Brandon felt as if a storm had passed through him. But there was no wind there. There was no rain. Just the certainty that that woman would change something. He just didn't know what yet. The days that followed were enveloped in an eerie calm, as if the world had been covered by a veil as thick as the one Layla wore. Brandon tried to stay immersed in the obligations of his new position, reports, meetings, adjustments to the contracts he had inherited from his father, but in every moment of silence, in every pause between one sentence and another, there was a thought that returned like a cold breeze from under the door. "She is coming, she will be my wife, and I don't know anything about her." The wedding had been scheduled for 8 days later. There would be no party, just a discreet ceremony in the mansion's gardens, with a limited number of guests, a requirement of the will itself. "Solemnity, not spectacle," said the clause. Brandon read it as another form of posthumous control. Until he died, Carter Whitmore dictated the rules. Vivian, as always, took charge of the organization with clinical mastery. She defined colors, flowers, servants' attire, menu, schedules, and the positioning of chairs. Brandon stayed away from everything. He just nodded his approval, as if he were not participating in his own destiny. Layla, in turn, remained absent. He settled in a country house half an hour from the mansion, refusing interviews, visits, and photographs. He didn't ask for anything. It required no changes. He gave no opinion on absolutely any details. He simply stated that he would accept the terms, show up at the designated time, and read the votes out loud. This absolute silence began to generate a curious effect. Where there is no information, there is assumption. And where there is assumption, there is judgment. And that's what started to happen. Brandon noticed the subtle tone in the hallways, even among the most discreet employees. Muffled whispers, avoided glances, gossip between dishes and silver polishers. At the company's headquarters, the story had spread more quickly. An arranged marriage, a mysterious woman, a reluctant heir. That was all it took to fuel a small rumor fire. "They say she had a serious accident when she was a teenager," commented one of the vice presidents, in a routine meeting, thinking Brandon wasn't listening. "Or that she has some severe phobia," replied another with a smirk. "Maybe I don't even speak English. Or maybe you're too beautiful and don't want to be ogled," suggested one of the secretaries in a more romantic tone. Brandon didn't react, but it bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. Why did he care? He didn't want this union. I didn't believe her. And yet the idea that they were painting Layla as an urban legend disturbed him. One night, he went out to walk through the property's gardens, a habit he had inherited from his childhood when he needed to escape his father's shadow. Low lanterns illuminated the stone paths between rose bushes and magnolias. On one of the benches next to the artificial lake, he stopped, sat down, and remained there quietly. He took out his cell phone. The screen glowed, and the first notification was an email from the company's communications department asking for authorization for an institutional publication about the union with the Al-Karim. Deleted the email without responding. The phone remained in his hand for a few more seconds. Then, without thinking, he typed into the browser, Layla Al-Karim. Nothing new, just brief mentions in scientific articles, medical conference notes, academic records. No images, no social media profiles, no statements. It was as if she lived between the lines, not the words. The next day, Vivian found him in the library, engrossed in an old book about geopolitical alliances. "Are you running away or trying to understand?" she asked, approaching with a cup of tea. "Maybe both." She placed the cup on the table and sat down without asking permission. "What do you see when you look at her?" Brandon took a while to respond. "I don't see anything. And that's what scares me." Vivian smiled, but not in a condescending way. "Maybe that's the point. You've always been surrounded by people who want to be seen, and suddenly someone shows up and doesn't want to show anything. It bothers you because it challenges you." Brandon was silent. She was right, but it was more than that. There was something about her that escaped, like trying to hold water in your hands. On the morning of the ceremony rehearsal, Brandon appeared in a dark grey suit, clean-shaven with a closed expression. There were just him, Vivian, the officiant, and a few employees supervising the assembly. Layla did not attend. "She dismissed the rehearsal," said Tariq, who had returned to monitor the preparations. "He said he prefers to let the gesture speak for itself." Brandon didn't respond. He just looked at the hallway of white chairs lined up to the sound of nothing. Not even music, no emotion. At the end of the day, when he returned to his room, he found a small box on the dresser. There was no sender, but inside it was a single object, a book of Arabic poems translated into English, marked by a page sign in female handwriting. Silence is not absence, it is presence on another frequency. Brandon held the book for a long time. Then he placed it on the pillow. And for the first time since his father's death, he slept with the window open. The day dawned overcast, but without rain. One of those pale mornings that Seattle seemed to save for important occasions, as if the city knew how to be discreet when necessary. In the east wing of the Whitmore mansion, servants worked silently, moving chairs, adjusting fabrics, checking details. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon. There would be no excess guests, just a dozen hand-picked faces, board members, key shareholders, a few pale blood relatives. No camera, no headlines. Brandon woke up feeling like the day was going to be long. The outfit was already prepared. A navy blue suit with an Italian finish that he had chosen without thinking, just nodding his head when the tailor presented the options. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a man too dressed up for an event he himself didn't believe in. Vivian appeared at her bedroom door with a light tap on the wood. "Do you need something?" she asked, observing him carefully. "Yes, I need a way out." She entered, walking lightly. "The only way out now is forward, and you know it." Brandon didn't respond. He just adjusted his shirt cufflink and walked towards the door. In the garden, benches were arranged with surgical precision, rows of light wood between bands of white flowers and oriental lanterns dangling delicately. The ambient sound was that of birds and wind. The officiant, a retired judge with a calm expression, was already waiting. Tariq arrived a few minutes later, with the same elegance as always, greeting everyone with the poise of someone used to mediating wars with a handshake. Layla came soon after, emerging from the car like a shadow of white silk. Her dress was simple, dull, cleavageless, with long sleeves and an impeccable fit. The veil this time was pearly white, even thicker than the one worn on the initial visit. Still, there was something about her posture that caught your attention, a kind of silent firmness as if she were made of rock inside. She walked down the hall alone. No music, no father, no bridesmaid. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. No words other than those necessary were spoken. "Do you, Brandon Whitmore, accept Layla Al-Karim as your wife on the terms here stated?" "I accept," he said, his jaw clenched. "And you, Layla Al-Karim, accept Brandon Whitmore as your husband according to the terms stated herein?" "I accept," she said, in a clear voice and without hesitation. The judge declared them legally married. There was no kiss. Brandon just touched the side of the veil and pressed his lips against the fabric with the lightness of a symbolic gesture. There was no visible emotion. There was no clapping other than the few hands forced to applaud. Brandon didn't look at her as he walked down the hall back to the house. He just offered his arm, which she accepted lightly. The two walked like diplomats after signing a treaty. In the official photograph, he kept a serious face, and she kept her veil on. The photographer didn't ask for smiles. During the intimate dinner that followed, served in the mansion's smaller hall, Brandon noticed how Layla's presence altered the atmosphere. She didn't need to say anything. She was sitting next to him, her hands delicately folded, the plate in front of her untouched, her face still hidden. Still, the gazes in the room gravitated toward her like a magnetic field. It was as if his invisibility was the most visible thing in the night. "Maybe she's mute," muttered one of the guests, more drunk than he should have been. Brandon clenched the glass in his hand. "Maybe you should take care of your glass, not my wife." The word came out strangely. My wife. It sounded fictitious. Layla, in turn, did not react. She elegantly picked up a glass of water without taking off her veil and simply took a sip through the fabric with a practiced gesture. Later, at the end of the event, the house emptied. Most left without knowing how to comment on the ceremony. There was no story to tell, just an official record. Two heirs of empires, now united. Brandon climbed into the bridal suite with slow steps. The door was already open. Layla entered before him silently. The room was decorated with soft flowers, scented candles, and a roaring fireplace. A theater set up for an intimacy that didn't exist. He took off his jacket and dropped it on the armchair. She walked to her dressing table and began to gently remove her earrings. The image was almost poetic. Almost. "Do you intend to sleep with this?" he asked, in a tone more acidic than he would have liked. "It wouldn't be the first time," she replied. He stopped. "So this is how it is? A life of formality and silence?" She turned to him gently but didn't relent. "Maybe silences say more than words." Brandon didn't respond. He walked to the window and opened it tightly, letting the cold air in. There they were, two strangers united by a contract, two names engraved on a certificate, two destinies crossed by a man who no longer existed, but still controlled everything. And between them, the veil. Always the veil. The second day of the wedding began as the first had ended, in silence. The type of silence that does not welcome but delimits. Brandon woke up before the sun, a habit he had inherited from his years of corporate training with Carter. He got up mechanically, got dressed in 30 minutes and was in the main office before 7 in the morning, with a cup of coffee in one hand and his cell phone in the other. The house was still asleep, or at least it seemed so. Deep down he knew she was already awake. Layla seemed to move like the breeze, no noise, no trace, but leaving something behind. Since the night before they had exchanged less than 30 words, she didn't question his silence, nor did she seek conversation. She just discreetly settled in the north wing of the house, using the bedroom connected to the suite, as if she always knew she wouldn't be welcome in the main bed. There was no confrontation, no visible hurt, just the silent pact of two strangers sleeping under the same roof because of a subscription. The housekeeper, Nora, approached the office with a meal plan for the week, trying to maintain a modicum of normality. "Mrs. Layla preferred to have breakfast in the greenhouse this morning," she said without looking up. Brandon raised his. "In the greenhouse?" "Yes, sir. He got there before sunrise. He just asked for tea and fig bread." The sentence seemed simple, but it awoke a vivid image in him. Her figure dressed in her discreet attire, among ferns and orchids, with the morning light drawing soft contours on the veil. It was an image he didn't want to conjure. And yet, she graduated alone. At noon, they briefly crossed paths in the central corridor. He was leaving the office. She was coming from the library, holding a dark-covered book with post-it notes. She wore a pearly grey dress and a veil of light fabric, almost transparent, but which still hid more than it revealed. What Brandon saw, or thought he saw, was a pair of watchful eyes, staring at him without accusation, without invitation. "Can I help you with something?" he said on impulse. "No, but thanks for asking." Her voice was as steady as the first day, but there was a pause before each sentence, as if she always thought one more time than him before answering. That night during dinner they sat at the same table. The distance between the two was symbolic but palpable. She kept the veil. Brandon didn't comment. The food was served in silence. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound among the ceramic plates and crystal glasses. "The team seems more efficient lately," he commented, breaking the ice without knowing why. "Sometimes when we are looked at kindly, we want to do better," she said, without irony. He frowned. "Are you watching the team?" "I'm living here and I respect the place where I live." Brandon didn't know what to say. She wasn't confrontational. I was just saying. And yet the phrase hit him like an accusation. How many years had he lived there without looking at the faces of those who served the house? She, having just arrived, already knew everyone's names. At the end of dinner, she stood up with a slight nod. "Good evening, Brandon." He responded with just a look. There was nothing more to say. But when he went to the reading room later, he found the book she was carrying earlier left on the small table next to the sofa. It was a treatise on medical bioethics and reproductive rights, with underlined passages and handwritten comments. Its handwriting was clean, precise, the kind of notes he hadn't seen since college. He leafed through it for a few minutes, just out of curiosity. Found a sentence underlined with double dashes. "The female body does not need to be explained to be respected." He closed the book. The next morning, he went down to the cafe and found his favorite cup, a handmade ceramic piece with the symbol of the university where he studied, already on the table. Full, no sugar. Exactly how he took it. There was no one around, just the cup, and a folded note next to it. "Routine can be kind, even when the world is not." No signature. But he knew who it was. Brandon took a deep breath. That wasn't affection, it wasn't an achievement. It was something more uncomfortable. She was present, without forcing, without demanding, without imposing yourself, but present. And little by little, it was starting to make a noise inside him. In the third week of living together, the house was no longer the same. Brandon noticed the changes first, like someone watching small noises disappear without realizing it. Breakfast began to be served more punctually. The kitchen menu was more varied and lighter. The servants moved with less hesitation. The flowers in the vases seemed more vibrant. And, a detail impossible to ignore, the library, which had been without a real human touch for years, was now organized by themes, authors, and even colors. Nobody said anything, neither Layla nor the employees. But he knew. The silent order came from her. Nora, the housekeeper, was the one who accidentally let it slip. "Ms. Layla just asked that we leave the library doors open during the afternoon. She wanted natural light to come in for longer." Brandon nodded, but inside one thought bothered him. She was rearranging the house from the inside, without ever raising her voice, without imposing a single rule. Little by little, Layla became a figure known to everyone, except him. It was as if he was the only one still walking in the dark, stumbling in her absence, while the others were already learning to move around him. At dinner on Wednesday, over pumpkin soup served with artisanal toast, something that wasn't on the old Whitmore menu, Brandon tried to start a conversation. "Have you always had this ability to rearrange environments?" Layla, as usual, remained straight in her chair. Her veil that night was a dark green, almost black, edged with gold thread. The fabric moved slightly when she breathed, but it never betrayed what lay beneath. "I just observe, and I correct what is out of alignment." "Aligned with what?" "With what could be better," Brandon smirked. There was a provocative intelligence in his words. There was no arrogance, just clarity, and that somehow made him uncomfortable. The next day, a new detail emerged in his work routine. A document about one of the hospital expansion projects, the kind of complex technical report that would normally require hours of review, was left on his desk with blue notes. The letter was hers. The observations were accurate, clauses with a margin of ambiguity, proposals that excessively favored suppliers, deadlines incompatible with market reality. He called his assistant. "Who delivered this?" "Ms. Layla asked for it to be put there. She said she read it out of curiosity." Out of curiosity. Brandon reread the observations, and with surprised discomfort he realized she was right. He would make those changes, and it did. Late in the afternoon he found her in the garden. She talked to Nora about growing lavender, in a low, fluid tone. When he saw him, he just turned his face towards him. "I read your report," he said bluntly. "I didn't mean to break in. I just thought maybe I could contribute." "Did you study finance?" "No, but I grew up hearing conversations about them." "Can you read contracts?" "Carefully, yes." There was a moment of silence. Then he said, "Do you want to participate in the next meetings about the foundation project?" She looked at him from behind the veil. The eyes were dark, firm, without a doubt. "If I am allowed, I accept." Brandon nodded. He didn't know why he offered. He didn't know whether he was asking for help or challenging her. "What I knew was that I could no longer ignore the fact that she was always one step ahead, and that she did it with the calmness of someone who never had to prove anything to anyone. That night, he had dinner alone in the office, but he missed the silence at the table, the soft clink of her spoon against the china. Something bothered him. It wasn't attraction, not anger. It was curiosity, a curiosity that burned beneath the skin. And the worst part, she was the one who dominated the rhythm, without raising your voice, without showing your face. It was Monday when Layla first appeared in the Whitmore Foundation meeting room. The invitation had come from Brandon, even if he didn't call it an invitation. He had just said, "If you want to follow, you can come." And she, as always, just nodded, as if she had already decided before the question was asked. The oval room was adorned with wooden paneling and large glass windows. 12 people sat around the table, all accustomed to speaking, projecting, dominating. When Layla entered, eyes followed her as they would any anomaly in a predictable environment. His presence caused noise even without sound. She wore a graphite dress, smooth, elegant, and the veil was the same color, discreetly covering her face, but revealing enough so that her eyes could be read. He sat next to Brandon, not looking around, not smiling. The straight posture, the absolute silence. The planning director tried to break the ice. "It's a pleasure to have Mrs. Whitmore with us. I hope our agendas aren't dull." She responded kindly. Nothing is boring when it can transform lives. Brandon didn't look at her, but he felt a slight tension in the air. That sentence, said without pretension, had silenced those who were there out of vanity. During the meeting, she said nothing, but I wrote it down. I watched. And from time to time, Brandon noticed with a sideways glance the way she listened, not as someone who waits their turn to speak, but as someone who processes everything, stores and analyzes it. That impressed him, and, although he didn't admit it, he was comforting. After closing, when everyone was dispersing, she approached him in the hallway. "There is something about the mobile clinic expansion project that needs review." He stopped. He turned around. "Did you see flaws? Inconsistencies? Mainly in the way the proposal deals with regions with low digital infrastructure. The solution designed presupposes constant connectivity." Brandon stared at her. "Did you notice this 1 hour into the meeting? I grew up in places where instability is the rule, not the exception." It was the first time she talked about herself, even indirectly, and that was enough to trigger something inside him. Recognition. The first crack in the wall. Small but real. In the days that followed, Layla participated in 2 other meetings. He never said more than necessary, but his notes began to circulate. His suggestions, when passed on by Brandon to the directors, yielded significant changes. The CEO of a partner startup even commented, "Where did you get this idea about segmentation by age group crossed with socio-cultural variables? It's genius." Brandon replied, "From my wife." It was the first time he called her that in public without embarrassment. At home, coexistence remained contained, but undeniably denser. Dinners now had less awkward silence. There was an exchange of phrases, 1 or 2 questions, comments on books left in the reading room. She read a lot, but he read the world even more carefully. "Have you ever thought about reorganizing the model for hiring specialists by period?" she asked one night. He looked up from his plate. "Are you referring to the Foundation's rotating consultant program?" "Yes, there are extremely qualified doctors who do not want to live in large centers, but would be willing to work for seasons. This would reduce costs and increase impact." Brandon took a moment to respond. "Did you think about all this, today?" "I've thought about it for years. There just wasn't space to say it." The phrase remained in the air. Brandon understood that she wasn't just talking about medicine. That night, he watched her as she arranged the side table in the living room with a new arrangement of flowers. She did this every week, without fanfare. The colors were always different. Perfumes, too, as if she redesigned time in detail. Her veil fluttered slightly in the wind coming from the open window, and Brandon had an almost involuntary thought. She was more visible with the veil than many women he had known without it. The next day, as he left the meeting room, one of the directors discreetly pulled him away. "Your wife is enigmatic." He didn't respond. But when he got into the car and Layla sat next to him, he looked at her before driving off. "Have you always been like this? Invisible, but impossible to ignore?" She didn't smile, but he replied, looking straight ahead, "Only those who have been ignored learn to take up space without making noise." Brandon drove in silence. But something in him, deeper than pride, older than fear, was beginning to give way. It was Saturday. The mansion, silent as always, seemed to breathe in a different rhythm on weekends. The meetings ceased, the assistants disappeared, and the noises of the world were reduced to the sound of the wind beating against the windows and the clicking of footsteps echoing in the dark wooden corridors. Brandon had woken up earlier than usual, even though there were no appointments. There was something about the last few days, a silent unease, that kept him awake even without alarms. It was as if his body was trying to warn him that something important was about to happen, even though he didn't know what. He spent the morning immersed in documents about a new research center the foundation intended to open in Arizona. I had to approve an absurd budget for a project I didn't even like. And still, the numbers danced on the page without fitting together. He couldn't concentrate. Late in the morning, he decided to walk to the library. It was rare to do this without purpose, but something drove him. Upon entering, he noticed that the lighting had been changed, more natural, softer. The shelves were organized by themes that had never been considered before: well-being, philosophy, mental health, spirituality. And on the coffee table, there was a manila envelope with his name written in hand. Brandon looked around. No servants, no shadows. He took the envelope and opened it. Inside, a single object, a sheet music. It was a piano composition, title in Arabic, with English translation in the footer: When Silence Breathes, When Silence Breathes. Next to the sheet music, a small note written in blue ink. That's the sound I was never asked to play, but it still exists. Brandon stood still for long minutes, staring at the paper. I didn't know she played. I didn't know anything about his relationship with music. I had no idea where that piece came from or what it represented. But something about her handwriting, the tone of her message, the gesture of sharing something so personal, hit him in an unexpected way. That night, he went quietly down to the music room, a rarely used space with a grand piano that Carter had bought just to maintain the appearance of a cultured mansion. He himself had never known how to play. Neither does Brandon. But when he approached the instrument, he found a second note on the closed lid. No envelope, just loose words on notebook paper. I don't expect you to hear it now. I just wanted you to know it exists. Brandon sat there, didn't touch the keys. It just stayed. The hall was plunged in shadow and silence, and for the first time in a long time, he was in no rush to fill the void. Hours later, when he went up to his room, he found the door to Layla's room ajar. For the first time. She wasn't there. Just a low light on, and on the dressing table, a half-empty cup of tea and a book left facing out. Sound and Silence, Essay on Invisible Bonds. He didn't go in. He just stood at the door for a few seconds, and then he closed it slowly, with a care that even he didn't know how to use. The next day, before breakfast, Brandon asked Nora, "Find out if we can find a piano tuner by Friday." She looked at him, surprised, but didn't ask any questions. As he walked back to the office, Brandon felt a strange discomfort. It wasn't fear, not anger, it was desire. Desire to see beyond the veil. But, for the first time, not to know what she was hiding, and yes, to understand what she protected. Wednesday dawned with a heavy, colorless sky. The forecast said the rain would come later, but the Whitmore mansion was already immersed in a subtle damp, the kind that seeps through the cracks, into the bones, into the thoughts. Brandon had been in his reading room since 7, but he hadn't read. He leafed through a book as if the pages might whisper something, anything that would distract him from the restlessness he carried on his shoulders. I had slept little, and what little sleep I had had was filled with disconnected images, veils fluttering in the wind, melodies without origins, looks that seemed to play without touching. Ever since he found the sheet music, something had ignited inside him, a kind of internal noise. It wasn't exactly emotion, not passion, it was attention, directed, persistent. Layla, once just a name, was now a living presence who walked the halls, read books, arranged flowers, deciphered reports, and left traces. That day, when he went down to the cafe, he didn't find Nora. He was the one who poured his own coffee, and noticed, when he opened the refrigerator, that there was a jug of tangerine juice with a handwritten label, "No sugar, as you prefer." There was no signature, but the gesture spoke more than an entire paragraph. In the afternoon at the Foundation's office, Brandon joined a call with European investors. The agenda was dense. restructuring the assets of the Munich branch. In the middle of the presentation, a clause in the contract led to an impasse. Time stretched. The lawyers argued among themselves. He almost got angry, until next to him, a sheet slid discreetly across the table. Layla, silent, impeccable, observer. On the sheet, a single sentence written in blue pen: "If you reframe the proposal as a cultural extension and not a contractual requirement, they will give in." He looked at her. He didn't say anything, but he read the sentence aloud, rephrasing it as suggested. The response was immediate. The impasse dissolved. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. "Did you read the entire contract?" he asked, already in the elevator back. She responded without vanity. "Just the part where you hesitated." That took him apart a little inside. Later he saw her in the library, sitting, reading. He didn't notice when she looked at him, nor that her eyes had stayed there too long. He only realized that when he tried to get back to work, he couldn't stop thinking about that answer. Just the part where you hesitated. It was as if she were mapping the voids inside him, and without asking permission, occupying the spaces he never knew how to fill. Over the next few days he began to notice her schedule. The books I picked up, the corners of the house where she liked to be when the sun shined through the window in the afternoon. He passed by those places in a casual way, without admitting to himself that he was looking for her. But it was. One night while she was watering the plants in the greenhouse, he watched her through the crack in the door. Not out of desire, not yet, but for something more uncomfortable. He wanted to know who she was before that silence. On Friday, upon returning from an external meeting, he found the suite with a slight change. The lighting changed, the carpet newly cleaned, a book on the bedside table, an essay on privacy and cultural identity, and inside it a handmade bookmark, woven with golden threads. The marker had a small underlined section. "Identity is not in being seen, but in being understood without being exposed." Brandon ran his finger over the sentence, and he stayed there, standing still. Something was happening, but he didn't know if he wanted it to continue, or if he was afraid of where it might take him. It was Sunday, one of those days that start slowly, as if time itself was stretching out. The mansion, immersed in yellowish light, seemed suspended in another reality. Brandon woke up before the alarm clock, an old habit. But instead of getting dressed for work or hiding in the office, he came down with his shirt open, feet bare, coffee in hand. The house was silent, like always, but that silence seemed less hostile, almost comfortable. He found her in the greenhouse. As on other days, Layla watered the plants with slow, careful gestures. The light vapor of wet earth hung in the air. The veil she wore was beige, translucent at the edges, and seemed to dance in the breeze. He didn't see him right away, or pretended not to see. Brandon stopped at the door and leaned against the frame. "You like it here, don't you?" She turned around slowly, as she always did. Her eyes met his, direct but serene. "Yes, it's the only place in the house where things grow." He didn't know if that was a criticism or a neutral observation, but he smiled instinctively. The house was not made to grow, it was made to last. And that's exactly why it dies in parts. Brandon entered, sitting on a stone bench in the corner. The ground was still damp from watering. The smell of mint mixed with jasmine filled the space. "Do you always talk like that?" She raised an eyebrow. "How? Like someone who knows more than he seems." "I only listen to what others ignore." Silence. For some reason he didn't understand. Brandon felt like he could talk. There. As if the space, the scent of the leaves, the soft sound of the drops, everything conspired to make him let go for a moment of the armor he had worn since he knew he was someone. "My father never told me he was proud." Layla didn't move. He continued. "Not once, not when I got to Stanford, not when I signed my first deal, not when I was named interim CEO. Nothing. It just said I didn't understand the game yet." She approached, without making a sound. He sat on the opposite edge of the bench, leaving space, but close enough for him to smell the subtle scent that came from her. Discreet, like everything about her. "Do you think you understand now?" Brandon took a while to respond. "I think I learned to play, but I never knew why." She looked down at the earth, at a newly planted lavender seedling. "When freedom is never offered, we learn to obey, as if it were a choice." The sentence cut the air. Brandon turned to face her. "Are you saying I'm a prisoner? I'm saying that perhaps you've never breathed on your own." That disarmed him. He was silent. Inside, something was moving. Not anger, not hurt pride. It was recognition. She looked at him firmly. "Do you know what freedom is, Brandon?" He hesitated. Then he replied with disconcerting frankness, "No." She didn't smile, but he lowered his head slightly, like someone who hears the right answer to a difficult question. Minutes later, she got up. "You have enough lavender now. The house will smell less like silence." Before leaving, he stopped at the door and added, "Freedom begins when you stop trying to conquer it." And then he left. Brandon remained there, alone, among leaves, roots, and a truth he never wanted to hear. He had built walls so high that not even the air itself could get in. But now, for the first time in years, he felt like he could, maybe, just maybe, start opening a window. The week started with a busy agenda. Review of the Foundation's clinical research portfolio, technical visits to 2 units in the interior of Washington, and a strategic round with a group of investors from the biotechnology sector. But despite the weight of commitments, Brandon didn't feel the same tiredness as usual. I felt something different, something unsettling, as if he was constantly waiting for a presence. On Tuesday afternoon, after the meeting with legal, Brandon returned to the office with a folder in hand. His head was full of numbers, or so he believed. When he entered, he found Layla sitting at the library table. He was reading a scientific article in English, with notes made in Arabic in the margin. A small detail, but it stuck with him. Her handwriting was clean, elegant, like precisely written music. He stood still for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Do you have time?" She didn't look immediately. "It depends. What for?" Brandon approached. "I'm rewriting the integration plan for the mobile units. I needed a more realistic look." She closed the book carefully, marking the page with a piece of thin string. "Realistic or suspicious?" Brandon smiled slightly. "Both." They sat in the office, facing each other. For the first time since the wedding, Layla removed her gloves, revealing slender hands with long fingers and precise gestures. She wrote it down, crossed it out, observed. For almost an hour, they discussed deadlines, logistical flows, technological dependence, and local difficulties. But in the end, the agenda changed. Brandon pulled a document from the bottom of the folder. It was an old project, abandoned by Carter years ago. An innovation center for crossover research in preventive medicine, aimed at neglected populations, especially women in low-income regions. "My father considered it corporate sentimentality," he said, passing the paper to her. "But I always thought it was the most human project." Layla analyzed the data in silence. "This is the only project where you speak as a man, not as an heir." He looked at her. She looked back, behind the veil, but with a firmness that exposed more than any skin. "Want to work on this with me?" he asked. "Only if you want to work with me. Not about me." There was a pause. Brandon took a deep breath. "I want." She nodded. The rest of the day passed strangely lightly. They talked little but fluently. The partnership was not comfortable. It was provocative. Each sentence was a test. Each idea, a step towards an understanding that they did not yet dare to name. The next night, Brandon walked into the music room. The sheet music she had left was still on the piano, but this time there was something new, a small box next to the bench. Inside, a cassette recording, an old format, almost symbolic, and a label. "Press play, just once, then decide if you want to hear it again." There was a recorder next to it. Brandon hesitantly pressed the button. Music filled the air. Era, her playing. Slow notes, sometimes hesitant, other times sure, building a melody made of absence and intention. Brandon didn't recognize the play. It seemed improvised, but what moved him most wasn't the technique. It was what was behind it. A silence between the notes that said more than words. When the track ended, he stood still. He didn't press play again. It didn't need to. That night, for the first time, he went up to the north wing in where her room was, and without knocking left an envelope under the door. Inside, a simple note. "I never knew silence could be music. Now I understand what you hear when you don't say anything." There was no response. But the next morning, next to his coffee cup, there was a small white flower, and he knew. The conversation between them had begun, finally, even though neither of them used their voices. The Whitmore mansion was surrounded by high walls, discreet cameras, and miles of carefully preserved forest. A sanctuary of privacy built for the purpose of keeping secrets in and questions from the world out. But even the highest walls cannot contain the appetite of public curiosity for what cannot be seen. On Tuesday morning, Brandon was woken up by an urgent call from his communications advisor. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to bother you so soon, but the newspapers picked it up. 3 big outlets have already published it. They're calling it The Invisible Wife." He sat up in bed, his heart racing. They published what exactly? Photos, comments from the charity brunch, theories. Some articles are speculating that she doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, which would be your invention, or a woman with severe disfigurement kept secret. One of them mentions that her absence on social media would be alarming. Another suggests that the foundation is creating a controlled myth to manipulate investments in the Middle East. Brandon closed his eyes for a second. What about investors? For now, silent. But they are watching. He disconnected the connection and quickly got dressed. When he came down, Layla was already in the greenhouse. It was always there, the space where she breathed, where he now also felt a little less prisoner. She was standing in front of a vase of white hydrangeas, still wearing a veil like always. He approached slowly. "They started talking," he said bluntly. She turned her face slightly. "They would always start. They're calling you a ghost, an invention, a hidden freak. And you're worried about what they think?" He hesitated, but he was honest. "No, I'm worried about what this will do to you." For the first time, she took a step towards him. "Do you think I'm not used to being judged, being seen as an enigma when I just want to be treated as a person?" The veil did not move, but his voice gained a new layer. Not anger, but weight. "Brandon, you invited me into your life, but never into your world. And now that your world wants to rip me away, you don't know whether to hide me or embrace me." He swallowed hard. "Do you want me to assume you? I want you to decide what I am. And stop treating me like a dilemma." The sentence remained between them like a plate of glass, invisible but insurmountable. Later that same day, a team from the foundation suggested holding a controlled exhibition of Layla's image, something discreet, elegant, symbolic, but that would calm investors. Brandon refused. "It's not a marketing action, and it's not for sale." In the late afternoon, he returned to the library. He found an envelope, this time addressed to him. Inside, a short letter. "Don't protect me from the world like someone who protects a child. Protect me like someone who recognizes an equal. I'm not afraid of what they say, but you seem afraid to find out what you feel. When you stop defending me and start recognizing me, maybe the world will stop attacking. L." That night, Brandon didn't sleep. He stayed in the study, staring at his father's portrait, still hanging over the fireplace. Carter Whitmore had built an empire, but he had never known how to recognize a human being. He didn't want to be Carter, but what was it then? When he went upstairs hours later, he saw a dim light burning under Layla's bedroom door. He almost crashed, almost. But this was not the time to ask for entry. It was time to build a path, even if in silence. The next morning, Brandon woke up before dawn. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night thinking about Layla's letter. It wasn't a cry for help, nor a protest. It was a mirror, and like every sincere mirror, said what no one likes to hear, that perhaps his greatest fear was never the judgment of others, but the very reflection of a feeling he couldn't name. At 7:20, I was already downstairs. He didn't wear a suit, just a light grey shirt and blazer. Too informal attire for someone who ran one of the largest medical foundations on the West Coast, but he wasn't going to a meeting. I was going to be positioned. He opened his personal laptop, wrote a short message. It did not go through its consultancy, nor the corporate image sector. It was just him, the screen, and a truth that no longer fit behind the silence. Published a simple text on the Foundation's official website. Title, "What is visible is not always what matters." In the last few days, they've talked about my wife. They've talked about what they don't know, what they've never seen, what they prefer to assume rather than know. They talked about the veil, from silence, of mystery. But no one talked about her intelligence, the way she transformed inefficient processes into functional ideas, the way he reorganized teams with more empathy than any consultant. I didn't marry an image. I married a mind, with a presence. And if that bothers you, the problem is with each person's mirror. The face you demand does not change what she represents, and if she remains veiled, it is not to hide. It's because you chose to show yourself in another way. Respect. The message gained strength in the first few hours, not because it's dramatic, but for being clear. For the first time, Brandon Whitmore spoke for himself. For the first time, he undid, in words, some of the legacy of control he had inherited. In the afternoon, while walking around the house, he found Layla on the balcony of the north wing, sitting with a book on her lap and a cup of tea beside her. The veil was dark blue, light, almost floating. She didn't say anything when she saw him, just turned the page in the book. He sat down next to her. Silence. After a while, he spoke without looking at her. "I didn't write that for you. I wrote it for me." She didn't respond. "I wrote it because I realized that you freed me, and I didn't know how to tell you that." Now, yes, she looked at him. "And now you know?" He nodded. She lifted the cup slightly. She took a sip under the veil. He placed it back on the saucer carefully. "Then start acting like someone who is free," and he went back to the book. Brandon smiled almost imperceptibly. That night, the news mentioned Brandon's note. Some praised the stance, others questioned. But what mattered was that no one else dared to talk about Layla as if she were an enigma in the public domain. Now she was a woman with a voice, even if it was silent. And he, a man who finally started to listen to her. The days following the public note were calm. Not in the literal sense. The foundation's phone rang more than ever. Shareholders reacted cautiously. Social columnists were divided between restrained praise and predictable criticism. But in the mansion, something had changed. The air between Brandon and Layla was different. They no longer treated each other with the weight of duty. There was no longer the awkward formality of the early days, nor the discomfort of two strangers in an inherited pact. There was respect, first of all, but now respect was accompanied by care. On Tuesday, upon returning from a visit to the new research facility in Tacoma, Brandon found his desk organized differently, not as if someone had invaded your space, but as if you were cared for by someone who I understood what he needed, before he even asked. A new document organizer, a book on ethical leadership, and a hand-woven bookmark with the foundation's symbol embroidered in silver thread. More than a kindness, it was a gesture that said, "I see what you're trying to be." That same night they had dinner together, alone, in the smaller room. There was no elaborate menu, just potato soup, artisan bread, and tea. But the simplicity of the moment had something that Brandon still couldn't name: comfort. Between slow spoonfuls and small silences, he ventured, "Have you always done this?" "What?" "Take care of the world in silence, as if no one was watching." She thought for a moment. "No, before I took care because it was expected. Now I take care because I want to see you in one piece." Brandon stopped. "I didn't expect that. Whole, without the weight that isn't yours, without the mask they taught you to wear." The phrase stayed between them like a candle lit in the dark. It didn't illuminate everything, but it revealed contours that were previously invisible. After dinner, they walked together on the porch. The sky was clear, and Seattle below twinkled like a sea of artificial stars. Layla kept her veil on. Brandon, by her side, no longer felt the need to see her without him. "I already saw it. In your words, in your breaks." How she knew that silence was not absence, but space. Near the door, she stopped. "Do you still want to hear that song?" He nodded. "Tomorrow, at 8, in the lounge." And then he entered, without explaining, without promising. The next morning, at 8 sharp, Brandon was in the music room. Layla was already waiting for him, alone, sitting at the piano. Without saying anything, she began to play. It wasn't the same composition as the recording. It was new, more fluid, less hesitant, as if she were telling a story that was only now ready to be heard. Brandon didn't move. He didn't speak, just listened. And when the last note died in the air, he didn't applaud it, just said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." She turned around. Behind the veil, he saw, or thought he saw, a slight tilt of the head, like someone who received something they expected, but didn't expect. That day, there were no statements. There was no touch, but there was something rarer. Two once-walled worlds had finally built a bridge, and about her, love began to permeate, even if it didn't have a name yet. On Thursday morning, the mansion slept in its usual routine of silence, leaves swept with precision and light footsteps in the hallways. Brandon, sitting in his office, reviewed contracts that would previously have taken him hours, but now, with Layla reviewing each paragraph, felt less cumbersome. The final document for the foundation's restructuring was almost ready, and with it, a new line of action that integrated cultural practices, community health, and preventive medicine, ideas that had been born from the careful eye of a woman who until recently nobody knew it existed. At lunchtime, Nora appeared at the office door. "Lady Layla asked you to meet her in the greenhouse, alone." Brandon didn't ask why. It just was. The sky was covered, but the filtered light made the greenhouse environment even more intimate. Layla was standing with her back turned, stirring pots of mint and chamomile. The veil was white, the dress light beige, neutrals, like always. But there was something different about his posture, a kind of contained vulnerability. She didn't turn around right away. "I want to tell you something today," he said in a low voice. "Not because I have to, but because now I can." Brandon approached slowly. He didn't interrupt her, just waited. "When I was a teenager, I lived a whole year without leaving home, literally. Not because of illness, not because of imposition, but because a video of me was shared by people who knew me, and who decided that my face, my body, my voice were products for consumption." Brandon felt the impact of those words like a silent beat, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real, tough, naked. It was a simple poetry presentation at school, but someone edited it, added offensive captions, and it went viral on forums where men and women distilled their need to reduce someone to a symbol of desire, of repulsion, of fetish, of judgment. My name became a joke, my image, a meme. She turned now. She didn't take off her veil, but his eyes were there, fixed on it. I could have disappeared, but I chose otherwise. I studied, I worked, I went to places where no one knew my name, and so I chose the veil, not because I have to, but because it gave me back control. For the first time, I was the one who said what would be visible and what wouldn't. For the first time, I was the one who set the limits. The world sees women and thinks they have the right to access. I decided to say not here. The silence that followed was the thickest between them yet. It wasn't discomfort, it was respect. Brandon took another step closer. He was less than a meter away from her. "And what do you want me to see?" She didn't hesitate. "I want you to see that I don't need to be discovered, just respected." He nodded, heart racing. The throat dries up, but clean eyes. "And you respect me," she replied without looking away. "Now yes, because now you see me without having to break my barriers." He smiled, for the first time a full smile, and he said in an almost inaudible voice, "Yes, I see you, not with your eyes, with what was left of me after you dismantled me." Layla took a deep breath. He turned back to the vases. He touched the earth like someone ending a conversation with a symbolic gesture. "I'm going to make a new tea tonight, something with hibiscus. It tastes like a fresh start." And he left, leaving a certainty in the air. The woman he knew for veils and silences now had a voice. And that voice was the clearest thing Brandon had ever heard in his life. The next morning, Brandon entered the foundation's presidency room with firm steps. The directors were there, some curious, others cautious. Since the public note about Layla, the views on him had changed. Neither admired nor suspicious. Just pay attention. He sat at the head of the table. He placed a folder on the dark wood and looked around. "Before we start, I need to present something that is not yet on the agenda. Respectful silence." Brandon opened the folder. He took out a printed dossier with a simple name on the cover. Samira Project Psychological and Cultural Support for Women Victims of Public Exposure and Digital Violence. This project was born from a conversation, but it is much more than that. It is the creation of a permanent arm of the foundation aimed at welcoming, training, and reintegrating women who had their identity violated by the cruel logic of the internet. Women turned into a joke, a scandal, a target, when all they wanted was to exist. The faces at the table turned to him with increased attention. Some knew who he was referring to, others just noticed the weight. Brandon continued, "We will offer legal, psychological, educational support, but more than that, we will create a space where they can rebuild themselves without the pressure of justifying themselves. And yes, the name of the project is inspired by a woman, but it is about many." One of the directors flipped through the pages. "Is there a planned budget?" Brandon nodded. "We direct part of the reserve fund to social impact. The rest will come from new investors who are already interested in the proposal. And who will lead? Brandon responded without hesitation. Layla. The silence that followed was absolute, but there was no resistance. There was surprise, and, in many, admiration. Upon leaving the meeting, Brandon did not go to the office. Went to the greenhouse. Layla was there, as always, sitting among herbs with a notebook on her lap. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to her with a brief smile. I created something, inspired by you, but not about you. She looked at him. You understand the difference. I get it, and I want you to lead. She closed the notebook, looking at it with a serenity that disarmed him more than any grand gesture. So for the first time, Brandon Whitmore is creating something his father didn't plan. Exactly, she nodded. So perhaps now you have begun to exist too. That night during dinner, they didn't talk about the project. They talked about poetry, about the garden renovation, about classical music and movies they've never seen. It was the kind of conversation you only have with those who don't demand, just share. And before they said goodbye near the staircase that separated their wings, Brandon stopped. Do you still want to keep the veil? She took a deep breath. He thought for a moment. For now, yes. But now, by choice, not protection. He nodded. So, I'll keep looking at you the way I can, until the day you want to let me see more. You already see more than many who see everything. And it went up, alone. But knowing that someone down there was waiting for her, not in a hurry but with presence. Night had descended over Seattle with a starless sky. The mansion remained immersed in the same careful silence as always, but inside the library, something new was about to happen. Brandon was there, sitting in one of the leather armchairs near the unlit fireplace, his gaze lost somewhere between his books and his thoughts. On the low table in front of him sat a small pot of still warm, freshly brewed hibiscus tea. He didn't know why he asked her to come. I just knew I wanted to see her. Not her face, not yet, but her presence. I wanted that shared silence, that space where no response was required, but everything was understood. The door opened slowly. Layla entered. She was wearing a cream dress made of light fabric and, as always, her veil covered her from the top of her head to just below her neck. The eyes were the only thing visible, and in them there was serenity. There was strength. Brandon stood up. Thank you for coming, he said, in a lower tone than usual. She nodded, walked to the seat opposite his, and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time seemed suspended. Then Brandon broke the silence, but not in a demanding way. As someone who offers, I never asked to see you, because I understood sooner or later that it wasn't up to me. That you didn't owe me anything, but still, I wanted to. I wanted it for a while, and then I stopped needing it. Layla didn't react immediately. I just watched him. What do you see now, Brandon? She asked. He took a deep breath. I see the woman who taught me to listen, who freed me without giving me a speech, who transformed me without ever demanding change. And that's all I needed to see. Then Layla stood up. No rush, no hesitation. She stood before him, silent, firm. Her fingers, now free of her gloves, touched the lower hem of the veil. I used this for years to not be invaded, to not be taken apart by looks that didn't want to understand. But with you, for the first time, I want to be seen. Brandon didn't move. He just breathed, slowly, deeply, like someone preparing for something to be born. And then Layla, with slow movements, removed the veil. The fabric slid off her shoulders like water. It fell silent, without drama, without cinematic impact. Just true, and there she was. A real face, beautiful, yes, but not in the conventional aesthetic sense. Beautiful because it was whole, because he was sincere. Why I didn't apologize for existing. Eyes as dark as amber in shadow, marked eyebrows, a firm mouth and features that carried history. Soft marks of those who lived, of those who cried, from those who chose to resist. Brandon stared at her, and something inside him warmed unexpectedly. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a shock. He was relief. He stood up slowly. He stood in front of her, and with all the care in the world, he touched the side of her face with his fingertips, lightly, almost reverently. You are even more than I imagined. Layla smiled, a small but whole smile. Now you know. And yet, you choose to stay. He didn't hesitate. Now I understand. And so, I want to stay. She raised her hand, touched his. There was no kiss, no promise. Just two naked faces, for the first time free from fear. Months had passed since that night in the library, from the silent gesture in which Layla by choice dropped her veil, from the shy touch between hands that carried, each in its own way, marks of a heavy past. Now the Whitmore mansion was different, not in its structure. The corridors were still long, the walls still had old paintings, and dinners were often silent. But what inhabited that silence was no longer empty. It was peace. Brandon felt like a whole man, not because he had achieved something, but because having unlearned what was never his. He no longer walked with his father's name hanging on his chest like armor. Now, he was carrying another kind of burden, that of choice, that of loving without control, that of building without having to win. The foundation prospered. The Samira project, led by Layla, had expanded to 4 states. The initiative had been cited in international articles as a new model of social impact, based on active listening and identity reconstruction. Layla now appeared on panels, conferences, and interviews, with a clean face, steady gaze, and unhurried speech. Never sought the stage but gained presence. "Don't you miss anonymity?" Brandon asked one morning as they drank coffee in the dim sun on the main porch. "I'm sorry," she replied with her usual honesty, "but today when they look at me, I see less intrusion and more attention. And that's new, that counts." He smiled. They were building a new house outside the city, surrounded by trees and enough space to accommodate the plans that neither of them had previously dared to make. They talked about opening a research center with young scholarship holders, about publishing a book of chronicles about silenced voices, and, discreetly, they also talked about children, not as a mission, not as a duty, but as a real possibility, planted, not imposed. One afternoon, as they were sorting through the library books together, Brandon found the old sheet music, the first one Layla had left on the piano months before. He held it in his hands for a while. "Do you remember that?" he asked. She took the sheet, smiled, and replied, "It was my way of saying, 'I'm here,' before you knew how to listen." He looked at her, the face without a veil, the eyes full, the mouth relaxed. "And now," she approached, gently touching her forehead to his. "Now, we are here." That night they played together, he on the keys, still hesitant. She, with her hands on his, patiently guiding him. The sound that filled the hall was not perfect, but he was sincere. And finally there was nothing between them, not bad, not honey, nor silence. Just 2 paths that, although different, they decided to walk side by side. And when the world inevitably asks again, "Who is this woman?" Brandon will know what to say. "The only one who taught me how to love with my eyes closed." If this story has followed you here, thanks. In truth, because this wasn't a story about faces or appearances. It was about courage, about freedom, and about the kind of love we build slowly, without empty promises, but with real presence. Maybe you also know someone who chose silence because they have been judged too much. Perhaps be that person yourself. If at any point in this story you felt seen, heard, or welcomed, then it has already fulfilled its role. Subscribe to the channel here, because that's what I try to do with each video. Tell stories that touch where we usually hide. Not to entertain, but to find. People who feel, people who build their own path even without a manual. And now tell me, what part of this story stayed with you? Have you ever loved someone beyond what the eyes could see? Or have you ever been loved even when you thought you didn't deserve it? Right here in the comments. Let's create a space where you don't need to shout to be heard. You are part of this. And I hope to see you in the next video, because around here, we don't tell pretty stories. We tell stories that make sense.